largest, most comprehensive report into child sexual abuse within the Catholic Church.
New clergy sex abuse report. Details on a Pennsylvania investigation released this afternoon. We're at the state capitol. And an interview with a victim of sex abuse. Update on ISIS. The Pentagon examines progress in the fight against militants in Syria. And a ringing development. The U.S. military is returning something soldiers took from a Catholic church more than 100 years ago. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, August 14th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Pennsylvania officials release a landmark grand jury report about the Catholic Church. It identifies more than 300, quote, predator priests who molested children in 6 dioceses in the last 70 years. It also accuses church leaders of taking steps to cover up the abuse. It's the result of an 18-month investigation led by Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro. Correspondent Jason Calvi attended the Attorney General's press conference in Harrisburg. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. The report is nearly 900 pages long. It identifies some 1,000 child abuse victims, including boys and girls. The grand jury began its review back in 2016. They looked at some 500,000 internal church documents.
I'm here, finally, to announce the results of a 2-year grand jury investigation into widespread sexual abuse of children within the Catholic Church and the systematic cover-up by senior church officials in Pennsylvania and at the Vatican.
Today, Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro is demanding justice for these victims.
Who would have believed me? A priest in 1948 or 47 would abuse you?
This is not a vendetta against the church.
I just feel like my whole life has been a lie.
Court records in a largely secret, months-long legal fight over the grand jury's report say that it identifies 301 predator priests. The abuse allegedly took place in these 6 dioceses: Allentown, Erie, Greensburg, Harrisburg, Scranton, and Pittsburgh. The report claims some bishops brushed aside victims and protected abusers.
Some of the dioceses sought to prevent the entire report from ever seeing the light of day. In effect, they wanted to cover up the cover-up. They sought to do the same thing that senior church leaders in the dioceses we investigated have done for decades.
Washington's Cardinal Donald Wuerl was Bishop of Pittsburgh from 1998 to 2006. He's defending himself, saying, "I believe the report confirms that I acted with diligence, with concern for the victims, and to prevent future acts of abuse." Attorney General Shapiro says he's not backing down.
The time for institutions to place their own interests above protecting our children is over.
Cardinal Wuerl is mentioned in this report some 200 times. The report in total is 900 pages long, so there's still a lot to digest. But our colleagues at Catholic News Agency have found that of the 19 cases against priests that arose during Cardinal Wuerl's time as Bishop of Pittsburgh, they said 18 of those priests were removed from ministry immediately. Lauren?
So what happens to those priests who are still active in ministry?
So several priests are fighting claims against them. So what was released today was a redacted copy of the grand jury's report. The Supreme Court of Pennsylvania will have oral arguments in their claims in September. Now, the Diocese of Pittsburgh, the current bishop there, says there are just a few priests that are still serving actively in ministry. He says the diocese did investigate the allegations against those priests, and they found those claims unsubstantiated.
We'll be following this story. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, the president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, says he is profoundly saddened by the Pennsylvania report. The head of the Galveston-Houston Diocese says in a statement, quote, "As a body of bishops, we are shamed by and sorry for the sins and omissions by Catholic priests and Catholic bishops." Cardinal DiNardo also says he is holding meetings this week on the broader issue of safe environments within the church. In my exclusive interview with Cardinal DiNardo last week, he delivered a message to the victims.
I also want to say my apology in terms of the whole church that grieves with you. The responsibility falls on us as the bishops, but all of us bear the responsibility of grieving together and working together for the ongoing renewal of the church.
Cardinal DiNardo was speaking at the Knights of Columbus convention in Baltimore. Joining me now is Mari Collins, survivor of clergy sex abuse and a former member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. Mari, welcome to the program.
Hello, Lauren.
When you resigned from the Vatican Commission in 2017, you cited the conflict between what was happening behind closed doors and what was being said to the public. Do you think there are still mixed messages when it comes to the issue of sexual abuse and the Catholic Church?
I think there are. I think there are still forces within the Catholic Church, particularly at the higher level, that do not want to see change, who believe this issue of clerical abuse will go away, and they need to be faced down. The Pope himself, he agreed and he passed the recommendations that the Commission gave to him for stronger safeguarding, for accountability of bishops. But when it came to the actual implementation of those provisions, it was his curia who would not put them into action. And that's where things have got to change. There has to be something to stop that roadblock, because we can see with all the reports and everything that it is so necessary that we get change.
The Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Donald Wuerl, is writing about the role of laity in examining allegations of sexual abuse and rebuilding trust. When I interviewed him last week, he had this to say.
Once you have a panel that includes bishops, includes laywomen, laymen, and they're looking at a particular allegation, there will now be the expectation and the realization that this is going to be made public.
Do you believe the Church has implemented the suggestions of lay people?
No, I don't. And that was one of the reasons I resigned from the Commission. There were lay people on that, experts from around the world. That was why the Pope put it together, to get experts from outside the Church to come in and advise. But the expert voices were ignored, not by the Pope, but by his administration. And the big problem is clericalism, the attitude that only we know how to do it. And the fact that other people's experience, lay people's experience, and also a totally different perspective on the whole issue is being ignored is really the problem. And the Church have to see that they need that perspective if they are going to overcome this enormous crisis in the Church.
Well, as a survivor of clergy sex abuse, what does the Church need to do beyond apologies to address the needs of the victims?
Certainly, we've had the apologies, sorry it happened to you, sorry you were hurt. We have to be well beyond that now. What has to happen is far stronger accountability of the leadership, far stronger safeguarding provisions. And from the point of view of survivors, there has to be justice. All the canon law trials that are held of perpetrators are held under a pontifical secret, which means they're totally secret. And often the victims don't even have a part to play in it. They're not allowed to give evidence. And files have to be opened for victims. And those who have been found guilty, their names need to be published. I think this has happened in some of the dioceses in Pennsylvania now, but it needs to happen universally. The Church is obsessed with secrecy. And as a Catholic myself, and having worked on the Commission, I find it a huge impediment to moving forward. They have to be able to be more open, more accountable, and more transparent if they want to come through this devastating crisis.
Before we go, very quickly, do you believe that lessons have been learned between the 2002 crisis and now?
Not really, no. I still think many at the top are just wishing it away. They're just hoping that this is something that's going to pass. It's not going to pass. And country after country, we're seeing what happened in Ireland, what happened in America, Australia, France. And it is going to go on and on. It'll be in the African countries, the Asian countries. This is not a crisis or an issue that's going to go away, no matter how much some people in the church wish it would.
Mari Collins, former member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors and a survivor herself of clergy sex abuse. Thank you, Mari, for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren.
As dioceses in the U.S. grapple with another round of scandal, the head of the department in the Vatican that oversees cases of abuse and processes priest offenders is speaking out. The Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith is one of 9 congregations within the Holy See. It is tasked with promoting and safeguarding the Catholic faith. Alan Holdren is the EWTN Rome Bureau Chief. Alan, tell us how sex abuse cases are handled at the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith.
Well, today, Lauren, the person in charge of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is Cardinal Luis Ladaria. He just was named a cardinal this last June. He's carrying on the work of his predecessors, which included Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who in 2001, led by Pope John Paul II, took cases from a diocesan level, from local bishops that used to investigate cases of allegations of sex abuse by clergy in their diocese, and took them on here at the Vatican as part of the regular work of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. This has been ongoing throughout the Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's time there at the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, all the way through his time as Pope Benedict XVI, in which he largely didn't get credit for really putting in place the application of measures against abuse. But during his time, many priests who were perpetrators were brought to justice and laicized, brought to the lay state and out of the clerical state. They were no longer priests under his watch, Lauren.
So what is Cardinal Ladaria saying now? I understand he gave an interview.
Yeah, that's right. Cardinal Ladaria is carrying that forward through to the future here. He spoke to L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's newspaper, just recently in an interview in which he said that the Church is dealing with these cases of sex abuse. It may seem also that these are largely a problem of the past, a phenomenon of the past, because many of these issues of sex abuse or allegations are from decades ago. But he said that there is no sign, unfortunately, no certainty that there is an end to this insight. Ladaria, again, carrying on this work under Pope Francis, who has given a real zero-tolerance policy to cases of sex abuse in the Church.
Are there other groups within the Vatican that work on these issues?
Yeah, in addition to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, there is also the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, which was founded in 2014 by Pope Francis with the suggestion coming from bishops and cardinals, especially the C9 Cardinals group, this group of 9 cardinals, including Cardinal Sean O'Malley. And it was Cardinal O'Malley himself who was tapped to head up this commission, which he is still doing to date. And it's something that they work in the prevention of abuse, so future cases of abuse, working largely with dioceses, but being open to any person or institution that wants to apply measures that would prevent sex abuse anywhere in society.
Just last week, Cardinal O'Malley, who you were talking about, launched an inquiry into allegations made by 2 former seminarians at a Boston seminary here in the U.S. Thank you so much for joining us, Alan Holdren, EWTN Rome Bureau Chief.
Thank you, Lauren.
And authorities in Chile raid the headquarters of the Catholic Church's Episcopal Conference. It is part of the country's widespread investigation into clergy sex abuse. Prosecutors also recently summoned the Archbishop of Santiago, Cardinal Ricardo Ezadi, to appear in court. The former Archbishop of Adelaide, Australia, will serve his 1-year sentence for concealing clergy sex abuse in home detention and not in jail. Philip Wilson is the most senior Catholic priest convicted of covering up child sex abuse. The 67-year-old will be under strict supervision and will have to wear a tracking device. Wilson has denied the accusations and plans to appeal his conviction. Count on EWTN News for comprehensive coverage in these sex abuse scandals. We will continue our reporting here on EWTN News Nightly at CatholicNewsAgency.com and ncregister.com. You can view the Pennsylvania report on my Lauren Ashburn Facebook page. President Trump escalates his messy clash with former aide Omarosa Manigault. On Twitter, the president writes, "When you give a crazed, crying lowlife a break and give her a job at the White House, I guess it just didn't work out. Good work by General Kelly for quickly firing that dog." Press Secretary Sarah Sanders defends the tough talk.
The president is somebody who's always going to fight fire with fire. This is something that isn't new, and it's something the American people knew when they voted for him, and they overwhelmingly elected him to be the president of the United States. And since he took office, he has governed in a way that is helping all Americans.
Sanders says the president is not racist, and she said he personally denied using the N-word, which is one of the accusations made by Omarosa Newman. The Trump campaign has filed legal action against her for breaking her secrecy agreement. At least 22 people are dead after a bridge collapses in Genoa, Italy. It happened during a violent storm on a main highway linking Italy and France. Officials say all victims were in vehicles which plunged 150 feet into rubble. The collapse comes 8 days after another major accident on an Italian highway, one near the northern city of Bologna. The car crashes into pedestrians and cyclists near the iconic Houses of Parliament during morning rush hour in London. At least 3 people were injured, though none seriously. The driver was arrested at the scene. Police are treating it as a terrorist incident. Coming up, an update on the fight against ISIS in Syria. And I talk with the parents of a journalist and former Marine captain missing in Syria for 6 years. A new report from the United Nations warns ISIS poses a rising global threat. UN officials claim the terror group has up to 30,000 members in Iraq and Syria. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee joins us with a response from the Pentagon. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. A top coalition general would not say how many ISIS fighters he believes are still in Iraq and Syria, but he says that UN estimate, that 30,000, seems a bit high. He says right now coalition forces are working to contain ISIS militants from entering or leaving the region. U.S.-backed Syrian forces continue Operation Roundup, tracking down and capturing remaining ISIS militants in the eastern part of the country. But a new report from the United Nations paints a grim picture. Officials claim 20 to 30,000 fighters remain in the region. And despite the U.S.-led coalition's defeat of the group in Iraq and most of Syria, it's likely that a smaller, covert version of ISIS will survive. Today, UK Army General Felix Gedney says they're making sure the ISIS fighters that remain won't be able to regroup.
We know there are over 1,000, which is our initial problem in the Middle Euphrates River Valley. We also know that there are some ISIS fighters and a threat remains throughout Iraq and Syria, and we need to make sure that we do enough to ensure the security and stability post-liberation.
The UN also says ISIS has significant support in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. I asked the general about stopping the flow of foreign fighters.
So I'm wondering if the coalition there in Syria and Iraq coordinate with coalition, whether it's American and British, the counterparts in Afghanistan, to try to reduce that flow.
Well, the simple answer to your question is yes, we absolutely coordinate.
But the general didn't provide any more details. The other major battle in Syria is backed by Russia. Syrian troops loyal to President Bashar Assad are fighting to retake an area held by rebel forces, Idlib. Some say it could be the last major battle in Syria's civil war, which is now in its 7th year. UN officials say they plan to prioritize children in their humanitarian efforts in the war-torn parts of Syria. On the coalition side, American and British military are complimenting the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, for their work in maintaining security in the region and allowing Syrians to rebuild vital infrastructure. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the Pentagon. Thank you, Wyatt. 6 years ago today, American Austin Tice, a photojournalist and former captain in the Marines, was kidnapped in Syria. Tice went to Syria in 2012 as a freelance journalist. He filed his final story just south of Damascus, got into his car, and never made it to the border. 5 weeks later, a video emerged of Tice being held captive by unidentified armed men. Joining me now, Deborah and Mark Tice, the parents of Austin Tice. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us, Lauren.
Yes, thank you.
For the last 6 years, you have kept Austin in the spotlight. How are you holding up?
We're getting a little frayed around the edges, I think. The middle is still strong, but, you know, it's been a long time.
Is the government doing enough to help? This afternoon, the State Department said they believe he is alive. They have a special envoy, a presidential envoy for hostages, working on the release. And the FBI in April offered $1 million for information.
We've been very gratified with the support that we've received as a family and that Austin is receiving from his government. There's always more that we want to happen, and you know, we believe since Austin was taken in Syria and he's an American citizen, that the Syrian and American governments should engage and work together to bring Austin home.
Is that happening? It's been 6 years.
Right. Well, we're hugely encouraged about the recent appointment of a special presidential envoy, Robert O'Brien, and we hope that that means now we're better poised to have a direct engagement with the Syrians on behalf of Austin.
Let me ask you a little bit more about Austin and showcase his life. First of all, I went through his Twitter feed, and it was really very painful for me, and I'm sure just devastating for you to have to do that. On August 6th in 2012, he said, "For obvious reasons, I find this latest trend of attacks against media targets to be troubling, to say the least." At the time that this was written, were you concerned for his safety?
Well, I mean, of course, we were concerned for his safety, but keep in mind, he is a veteran Marine. He had been in the conflict zone twice before, and so he went as a witness to Syria. And, you know, we're told over and over again in the Psalms, do not fret. It's a challenge when your child is in dangerous places, but do not fret. We're called to that.
Your Catholic faith must be very important to you now, I would imagine.
It's hugely important. It is the sustaining factor, without a doubt.
Yeah, and it's amazing. In fact, after our last interview with you, or your network, how many expressions of hope and faith and support and prayer we received from Catholics all over the world.
All over the world. It was hugely uplifting.
I'm so happy to hear that. Another reason that I believe you're here in Washington is that an exhibit of his photographs is opening today at the National Press Club. We have some of those, and I would like to show them to you, the photographs that he has taken. We heard Wyatt say earlier that the UN says children are the most in need of aid. Well, look at this. Your son was highlighting children.
That was his self-assigned mission when he went to Syria, was to really amplify the effects of an urban conflict on non-combatants, especially women and children. And he just has a special place in his heart. He's the oldest of 7, and so he just sees himself as the big brother of the world, right? And he really ached for the suffering of the children.
Mark and Deborah, as a mother, as a Catholic, I cannot tell you how much I'm aggrieved by what has happened to your son. I know that the network, people watching, will keep Austin in their prayers. Best of luck to you as you move forward in this journey.
Thank you. Thank you for your prayers.
Thank you, Lauren.
The prayers of all your listeners.
Up next, Nebraska's governor on the first execution there in more than 2 decades. And the U.S. military is chiming in on bells taken from a Catholic church more than 100 years ago. Nebraska carries out its first execution in more than 2 decades. 60-year-old Carrie Dean Moore was convicted of 2 murders in 1979. The state's Catholic bishops tried to stop the execution, but Governor Pete Ricketts, a Catholic, denied the request. Pope Francis recently strengthened the Catechism's opposition to the death penalty. Catholic bishops in Florida also are trying to stop the death penalty as the state is scheduled to execute Jose Antonio Jimenez tonight. They write in a letter to Governor Rick Scott, quote, "Both victims of crime and offenders are children of God and members of the same human family." The Federal Drug Administration has approved the marketing of an app for fertility called Natural Cycles. It calculates when women are most likely to be fertile each month. A women's health professor from Georgia State University tells the Washington Times the app is in keeping with the Trump administration's emphasis on natural family planning over birth control. Finally tonight, the United States will return church bells stolen from a Catholic church in the Philippines more than 100 years ago. The Balangiaga bells at St. Lawrence Martyr Church in Samar were taken by U.S. soldiers in 1901. 2 were displayed at an Air Force base in Wyoming, and a third was in an Army facility in South Korea. People in the Philippines have lobbied for 2 decades to get them back. Happy ending. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.